What am I doing? I'm trying to get this all sorted.
We've been asking that for years.
I asked myself that, you just heard me do it. I mean, not having morning and afternoon tea is really...
I know.
It kills you.
It's a hardship.
It is.
You can't even get a cup of tea to wake up to.
What happened to that? What was it?
Well,
Is it more of the John Ajaka?
No.
It's
Michael
COVID.
Pratt.
Eh?
No, Michael Pratt, the Treasury Secretary, said, cut it, slash it.
Well, we could actually vote we could actually vote it in ourselves. We could take it as part of our
Let's
budget.
bring Michael Pratt back.
Yeah.
Are we on air?
Listen, we're on the air. We're complaining about lack of cups of tea. Okay, thank you very much for coming. Could each witness please state their name and position, title, and swear either an oath or an affirmation? Maybe starting with you, Ms. Winkworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I'm Kylie Winkworth. I'm a museum and heritage consultant and also associated with the Powerhouse Museum Alliance.
Thank you. And Dr. Griffin?
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I'm Des Griffin, the former director of the Australian Museum for 22 years until 1998 and involved in other museum activities.
I used to haunt that place when I was younger. You were probably director then. Fantastic museum. I loved it. Sorry. Professor Miller.
Declaring an interest.
Declaring an interest, yes. Australian Museum.
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
I'm David Miller. I'm Emeritus Professor of the History of Science at the University of New South Wales with 40 years or so experience teaching and researching in the history of science and technology. I'm here in a private
capacity. Okay, thank you very much. Would any of you like to, any or all of you like to give a short 2-minute presentation to open? Maybe starting with you, Ms. Winkworth.
Thank you. I would like to thank the committee for the time it's giving to these museum policy and infrastructure issues and for the broad terms of reference which implicitly recognise the connection between decisions on the fate of the Powerhouse Museum, a new museum at Parramatta which is universally supported, I want to say up front, and the opportunity cost of what seems to be a winner-takes-all museum policy. Museums matter, and that's why we're here. Decisions on museum development and infrastructure are an intergenerational commitment. A museum is a promise and a legacy from one generation to the next. We expect that legacy or inheritance to be preserved by the next generation, which is why the government's plan to uproot the Powerhouse Museum from its historic context has caused such deep concern. Decisions on museum projects carry substantial funding obligations for decades into the future, and they're a huge community and cultural commitment, a pledge of trust, if you like. Once made, these decisions are difficult and painful to unwind, so getting the planning right is vital. And this is why the Powerhouse Museum Alliance has worked so hard after the last 5.5 years to present other museum policy, infrastructure and funding options to the 2 museum inquiries that you've chaired and in our representations to government. And this is why we've consistently argued that the government should prepare a fair and equitable museum plan for New South Wales, one that supports museums, collections and communities in Western Sydney and regional New South Wales and landmark museums in Sydney. I hope that this inquiry can support this aim and that your deliberations will help the government to identify the major museum policy needs and opportunities for New South Wales, because we can do better, we can do more within the same envelope of funding. I'm going to skip some of this. In many ways, this inquiry has unfinished business from the last inquiry, not just because of that the saga of the Powerhouse Museum is continuing, and the new museum for Parramatta is still highly contentious, but also there are larger issues of fairness and equity for museums and communities across New South Wales. The New South Wales Government has made a very large funding commitment of at least $1 billion to build a new museum in Parramatta. The Premier has argued that this is important for Western Sydney, which represents 30% of the population of New South Wales. There's another 30% of the population living in regional New South Wales. I look forward to the Deputy Premier, John Barilaro, announcing a $1 billion museum infrastructure fund for regional New South Wales on the same grounds. Fairness matters.
Thank you. Dr. Griffin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee, which, as Ms. Winkworth has said, is very important. I think I endorse everything she has said. I think the most important thing I could add is that for the last 35 or so years I've been studying museums around the world, focusing especially on issues of management and leadership and governance, and questions such as what is it that contributes to a museum being highly successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee for allowing me to appear here today. I come here as a little bit as an outsider compared with many of your witnesses. My field is the history of science and technology. It's a field that throws light on the origins of current scientific and technological developments and the consequences that they have for industry, environment, and how we live our lives. I greatly admire the work of museum curators in collecting, preserving, describing, juxtaposing, and telling educative stories about the objects under their care. Thanks to them, locally, the Powerhouse at Ultimo has become a great museum of the history of material culture informing the contemporary world. My submission to this inquiry was prompted by the then intended move of the Ultimo Museum and the prospect of damage in transport to the Bolton and Watt beam engine or its disappearance into storage. I've done a lot of work on James Watt. We're told now that the Bolton and Watt will not be moved or put into storage. Neither will the Catalina flying boat nor locomotive number 1. This is good news, but I remain greatly concerned about the future integrity of the broader context in which these very large objects are currently displayed and which gives them their meaning. Both exhibitions, the Steam Revolution and Transport exhibition, and buildings, notably the supporting spaces of the Harwood building, appear to be under threat. This carefully constructed and curated context has been the continually updated work of decades and gives a deeper meaning to those large objects by using them and numerous other items on display in the museum to tell stories about technological transformation that are not just historically interesting but are of immediate contemporary relevance. They can teach us and our children about the nature of technological innovation, about the social, economic and environmental changes that drive it and flow from it. The digital world of images, electronic communication and instant information is not separate from the analogue world of power, objects and physical movement, but rather integral to it. Each supports and educates us about the other. In my experience, the digitally obsessed young are readily captivated by the analogue world. There's a danger that the so-called Contemporary Museum at Parramatta and the so-called Heritage Museum at Ultimo will be treated in practice as entirely separable ventures. In my view, this is myopic. Though they might have different emphases and different starting points, both need ongoing investment to connect understandings of the past, the present, and possible futures. Our ability to produce and communicate those ideas effectively depends on a museum that is well-resourced and cleverly curated. Thanks.
Thank you. Questions?
Okay. Ms. Winkworth, thank you for your efforts over the last 5.5 years.
You've been so active.
Now, I want to move on to your comments about a $1 billion fund for rural and regional areas. In fact, I think that's a sterling suggestion.
Do you commit a future Labor government to doing that?
It's very close. We will be making important announcements closer to
In the fullness of time.
Order, come on.
but I do,
You'll have the government outbidding you now.
no, but I do take your observation that the government claims to be spending $1 billion on the Parramatta site, and that there is. So what would you see to be the need, or what would you spend a $1 billion fund in rural and regional areas on? Would you in fact do a single museum, or would you move it? What would you do?
Well, as a museum lover, and recognising the education and tourism potential of museums, I think every community in New South Wales has a right to a well-constructed, purpose-designed, fit-for-purpose museum where they can show the treasures of their community. You heard this morning from Jennifer Sanders talking about the Powerhouse holding the DNA of our history and heritage. When we look at community museums in regional New South Wales, they hold the DNA of their community. These museums, they're the oldest and most numerous cultural institutions in New South Wales, and they're the most unrecognised and neglected. I think when the Minister gave evidence at the budget estimates last year, talking about the funds available for volunteer-managed museums, I think I calculated that of the $64,000 that were available for the volunteer-managed museums, it worked out at about $229 each. Yeah. And that's why I say there's unfinished business for this committee, and I just thank you again for the broad terms of reference, and I hope the committee will advance in its thinking about ways to help museums in regional New South Wales, because the answer is not volunteer training. The answer is resourcing museums so that they can look after their collections. We need paid collections officers in every region of New South Wales. We still have vast swathes of New South Wales, including major cities like Wollongong, where there's not a single professional museum officer engaged to support the community and its collections. And that is having a terrible effect, because it's not recognising the asset value of collections, so we're not investing in the infrastructure so that collections are looked after, and we're not investing in the people who can animate those collections and leverage their education and tourism opportunities. There's been a failure, I think, of government policy to recognise the importance of heritage tourism and of heritage destinations and attractions to our tourism industry. In 2018, heritage and cultural tourism was worth $14 billion to the New South Wales economy. That's extraordinary. The highest spending visitors to New South Wales are cultural and heritage tourists, and these are the ones that their top interest is visiting history, heritage, museums, monuments and sites. And yet when you look at where the government's infrastructure, cultural infrastructure investments have been, it doesn't reflect that interest and opportunity. And this is why we're so delighted to support the work that the North Parramatta Resident Action Group has been doing to make the case for the Fleet Street precinct in Parramatta as the obvious site for Parramatta's new museum, particularly since we know the Minister himself has said he supports World Heritage designation for that site, and we know that World Heritage designation is, it's the number one driver of cultural tourism. People put World Heritage sites on their bucket list, and when tourism comes back, what will take people to Parramatta, I don't think it's going to be a science museum. I think they'll say, there's a museum that's World Heritage listed. It's telling unique stories that I can't see anywhere else, because every major city in the world has a science museum, but the opportunity for Parramatta, and indeed for all our museums across regional New South Wales, is to tell those distinctive stories. And as I've previously argued here, the stories of Parramatta are the stories of the nation, and more than ever we need those stories to be told about the enduring culture of of the Darug people who lived in Western Sydney for thousands of years about the extraordinarily important and complex first contact encounters, about Parramatta as a thriving and successful multicultural community, and the success of Parramatta as a multicultural community since 1788. They're the big obvious museum opportunities.
Now, Ms. Winkworth, you've written, and your submissions and your evidence and your public comments relate to concerns about the flood site at Parramatta. Is there, other than putting the museum on stilts, as been the case, so would you recommend that the Fleet Street site or the female factory be the location?
Yes.
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 I'd just like that to be
Yes.
very clear in the evidence, though.
Yes, the Fleet Street site, for a whole range of reasons, including the flood risk, is the obvious location for a new museum. And this goes back to the faulty process that the government followed in first selecting the museum site on completely opaque grounds. Because as soon as we heard the Phillip Street site had been selected, it was obvious it was going to be too small and flood prone, and those flood risks cannot be mitigated or designed around.
So it's not too late to move?
No.
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 Tell me why it's not too
No,
late.
because as I said, don't get these choices wrong, because we expect museums to be forever. I mean, I know people think, it's been 5 years, not a single job created in Parramatta or Western Sydney, cultural job, that's true.
Oh, no, they spent $50 million on consultants.
Yeah, they're not cultural jobs.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted you, so... well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not too late, because
It's not too late.
you're familiar with the process here, that we make recommendations and things like
Yes.
that. So if one of the recommendations was that you go from the Phillip site to the female factory site, the Fleet Street site, so to speak, would you be comfortable with a recommendation to that effect?
I'd be cheering in the streets.
It's never too late to stop doing something stupid, is it?
Well put.
Okay, David. Or-
Could I ask about the flood study and I know that we'll have Melino Stewart later, but from a curator's, museum professional perspective, what do you take away from that most recent, the July flood study?
Well, I think the Melino Stewart report comprehensively demonstrates the grave risks that the development poses on that site, grave and insoluble risks. And as I'd argued in my submissions, the problem is that the flood issue has always been approached as a building design problem and not as an issue about risks to visitors and the collections. And that's where it becomes really serious. And there's also been a preoccupation with the riverine flooding when the larger risk is about the overland flooding, because the Phillip Street site is actually sited on what is in many respects a stormwater channel from the CBD to the river. And that's created the dilemma that all those pedestrian pathways around the site, in the event of a serious overland flood, are going to be a torrent of water.
And if I understand the report correctly, what it says is that when you get one of these floods, the site will be effectively isolated, and then the lower floor will be inundated. And so people will have to be somehow taken to safety on the site. But when the power's down and there are no ramps, that may be an impossible challenge.
Well, certainly the EIS has not answered those questions, as Melino Stewart have sort of carefully deconstructed. And it's my belief that those issues about the safety of visitors on the site and about their safe evacuation and management within the building are not able to be solved with the current design that's there. It's simply that the development is too big and too intense. There's been a failure to recognise the particular obligations we have to museum visitors and the intensity of use that this development is projecting. 2 million visitors a year, 5,000, which would be an average of 5,449 visitors or something every day, 360 4 days a year, and the difficulty and challenges of managing those visitors within 2 buildings that are inherently, as they're designed, unable to provide safe evacuation routes, either from the riverbank and Undercroft or to the upper levels of the development.
And indeed, some of the proposed evacuation routes take people in the event of a flood down to the river.
That's correct.
That-
Counterintuitive. And that's
a polite description.
And that's why our concern is that people will be stuck there in the Undercroft as the waters rise, and they won't be able to get out, because you're looking at the river rising and you're thinking, I'm not going to go down towards the river in a huge storm to get out of this nice dry shelter, which might be dry for a little while.
And Molino Stewart, it'd be fair to say you chose them because of their expertise in understanding the flooding risks in Parramatta CBD.
Yes.
Is that right?
They're the leading experts on the Parramatta River catchment and river hydrology in that area. It was my surprise, in fact, that they weren't engaged by the EIS to do their flood modelling. I was very pleased they were available to give us some expert advice. Throughout the whole process, since this site has been selected, it's my belief that there's been a misunderstanding, not willful necessarily, but a misunderstanding of what the risks represent. And I think when Molino Stewart and Dr. John McIntosh will be able, Steve Molino I should say, will be able to unpick those risks for you. But what struck me in the conversations that I've had with both of them is, you know, if the museum floor is set at the level of 1 in 100 flood, and Steve Molino has shown that that is too low for this type of development, then that is not a safe level. If we're looking, as I said, at buying a lottery ticket with a risk of winning of 1 in 100, we'd all go, that's a really good chance, isn't it? 1 in 100 for a lottery win. Well, yes.
I wanted to ask Mr. Griffin, in your submission you talked about the current proposed Parramatta site being too small, and I wondered if that was just in relation to too small to hold the very large objects as was originally proposed to be moved there, or now that those objects are not being moved from the Ultimo site, whether you still think that footprint of the proposed new museum and its current location in Parramatta is just not big enough for a museum of the sort of scale that the government has described it.
Thank you. I would go with the latter alternative. My understanding is that the proposal, in essence, says that the largest space is multi-purpose, as well as quite small. I think this relates also to the situation of regional museums, which I think would be best developed as a kind of network. And that means you're going to circulate exhibitions, you need quite considerable space, which is up to the highest standards for showing of exhibitions. And it just seems to me that the proposal does not really fit with the assertion that it is iconic and world-class, whatever those terms actually mean. I'm not sure what they mean. There's no prospect whatsoever of any museum in Parramatta being world-class if we think that that's put it in the same category as, say, major science and technology museums overseas or even in Australia. Nevertheless, it is reasonable to expect that the museum should be to the highest standards, and it should be able to serve the population and the visitors, tourists, in a number of different ways. And I simply, quite apart from the compelling issues of the flood, I'm blowed if I can see how that would be possible.
Are you familiar with the alternative site that's been proposed around the Parramatta Female Factory?
I'm not, but I would understand from what Ms Winkworth has said that it is certainly a preferable alternative. I'm certainly aware of the assertions that in the event of a flood, there's 15 minutes for the population to get out of the place.
Yeah, not a lot, not a lot of time.
No.
Professor Miller, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a little bit in your opening statement about how retaining the large objects at the Ultimo site, devoid of the context of the sort of broader exhibitions that currently exist around them, will very much diminish the sort of capacity of those objects to tell a story. And I just wanted to draw you out a little bit on that, because I do think that that is one of the sort of newer propositions that we've had in this committee inquiry, which is the suggestion that those objects will be retained at Ultimo, but very little to no commitment around anything else being retained outside them. And in fact, the suggestion that they could just sort of be sitting in the foyer of a lyric theatre or something like that, and wanted to get a little bit of your sense as to how that would diminish the story and the value of those objects if that were to be the outcome.
Yes, I'd be happy to address that question. I mean, particularly in relation to the Bolton Watt, which I know quite a bit about. I suppose the first thing to say is that objects don't speak for themselves, right? They have to be interpreted, and they have to be interpreted in relation to other things. And the reason that the Bolton and Watt is so interesting and is such a magnificent object is that it is close to the beginning of a process of evolution, of technological evolution, in which steam technology transformed, in fact, created modern societies in terms of its support of industry, its support of things like sewerage, electrical generation, and so on and so on. And so the important stories to tell, it seems to me, necessarily involve saying, well, here's the Bolton and Watt, which was in the beginning of these things, and here's the Maudsley, and yeah, here are massive engines that were subsequently developed that were used to generate electricity and to drive modern societies. And so it really is the case that if the large objects were stripped of this larger context, then it becomes very, very difficult to appreciate them, let alone tell stories to a public audience about them.
I also should say, if any other witnesses wanted to comment on that, I think that that would be useful, because I think that is, just in terms of the reality of the proposition that's sort of been put forward by the government now, that's sort of the direction it's heading, where those objects will be retained at Ultimo, but potentially very little else. So I wondered if just the consequence of that, not only for those objects, and as to whether or not you could even describe a facility at Ultimo with those objects sort of on their own as anything like a museum.
Ms. Winkworth, could you offer an observation or from your experience?
Well, certainly it's a very good question. The Powerhouse Museum Alliance, we've certainly identified the significance of the steam engines and the steam revolution installation in the engine house, the Bolton and Watt and the number 1 loco, and then the transport installation, transport, space and flight in the boiler hall, as being integral to the heritage significance of the Powerhouse Museum. And we've argued that the core of those installations should be recognised as part of the significance of the museum through heritage listing. What's important, I think, about the whole conception of the Powerhouse Museum, which was the whole business case, the whole investment case, was based around a spatially and conceptually appropriate place to display those collections, so that the Powerhouse becomes, in a way, a museum about itself, the power story in the Powerhouse. And there's no other museum in the world that presents that kind of narrative about the evolution of STEAM technology in such an extraordinary set of spaces, starting with the very foundations of STEAM technology and, right in the Galleria, purpose designed to hold the Bolton and Watt and number one loco, those two foundational technologies of motive power and transport, steam transport trains, in conversation with each other, the two foundation objects, and then you flow through to the Steam Revolution exhibition, and what's there in the Powerhouse is a whole narrative about the evolution and application of STEAM technology, as Professor Miller's been saying, and it's unique and very important, which is why we've been so concerned about the thought that the Maudsley would be pulled out of that installation, because next to the Bolton and Watt, it's the most significant engine, beam engine in the Powerhouse collection.
It's got an extraordinary Australian story to it too, because
It does.
wasn't it brought out here as the first steam engine and then used for the Goulburn Brewery,
It was.
which is kind of a nice...
1837, it's the earliest provenance steam engine that we know has worked in Australia. And part of the important history of steam technology in Australia is how forward-looking Australia was in its embrace of new technology. And that's a message that we want to see shared and communicated because we were never a culture that sort of cowered in fear about, embracing electric cars, as been recently suggested. Australia was a culture that was founded on innovation and the embrace of new technology, and it's those technologies which have powered the economy and development of New South Wales, all of New South Wales, and especially important in regional New South Wales.
Ms Winkworth, you mentioned in your opening statement about the Merlino Stewart report that you commissioned. Why did you, as a private citizen, commission that report?
Mr. Chair, we felt that the risk to visitors and the collections had been underestimated and not appreciated by those in charge of the development, the selection and development of that site. And after your previous inquiry had heard from Dr. John McIntosh, and then particularly with the import of the 9th of February flood, we just felt that these issues had not been properly assessed and considered. I felt that the way that the flood issue had been dealt with in the business case papers, which your committee secured the release of those, I felt that had missed the real point about risk for visitors and the collection. And as I said, all the way through, the flood issue has been seen as a building design issue, not as a matter of risk to visitors and the collection. And that's why I thought we needed to have some independent advice on this, because it's, I'm not a flood expert. I'm only just grasping what those risk issues are, and that's why I thought there needed to be an expert report to assist us and to assist your committee in understanding these issues.
But Ms Winkworth, you have had a role as a trustee of the Powerhouse Museum. So you're, and I think you had that role for 7 years or so. So you have experience in trying to do that risk assessment on a kind of board level, is that right?
Yes, I was a member of the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences Trust for 8 years, I think, yes. I think that unfortunately, the trustees of the museum have been disempowered in this whole process. They don't have a guiding role in this development, and I think they've been carried along because this is a development that's been set by the government, not by the trustees. So the trustees don't have agency in the fate of the museum and the decision to locate the museum on that site.
But if you were a trustee and you had this Merlino Stewart report in front of you, you'd have sleepless nights, I would have thought, about the prospect. I don't know, Robert, if you wanted to explore some of this.
Yeah, I wouldn't. If you read some of the paragraphs on page 14, for example, second paragraph on the left. The second problem this presents is that it directs overland flows along designated pedestrian connections between the river and Phillip Street. This means that should people by the riverside need to evacuate to escape rising river, they may be confronted by a torrent cascading down each of the possible escape routes. And it goes on. It's quite reasonable to expect that during inclement weather, museum patrons, or more likely members of the public, could seek shelter in the Undercroft areas. However, as shown in Figure 9, there are two problems in leaving these shelters once flooding commences. The first is that it is necessary to walk down towards the river before being able to walk up to flood-free ground. I mean, how you do that when it's flooding, I don't really know. And secondly, it's more like swim. The second is that the routes are designed as overland flow paths. People sheltering within these spaces may not appreciate just how high and how quickly the river can rise, and they become entrapments in which people drown or they drown trying to leave them.
If you were a trustee, Ms Winkworth, and you had this report in front of you, do you think you could, in good conscience, let alone in exercise of your duty of care, proceed with the proposed Parramatta development?
No, I don't, and I think it's an important question that you've asked. We've all seen the searing footage of what happened in Toowoomba and the Lockyer Valley with that supercell storm. Nobody would have thought that Toowoomba would flood like that, and yet it did. These things are happening now. I think it was Howard Collins, the head of Sydney Transport, said at one point about the extreme weather events. We're getting these 1-in-100-year weather events every year. And yet we learn from Melino Stewart that climate change for a building that's designed for a life of 100 years hasn't been factored into their flood modelling or the level at which the floor is set. I mean, my nightmare as a museum person is that there could be some if this goes ahead, there could be some dreadful storm event and people are seriously injured, if not killed. And I'd hate to think of an inquiry then being set up to understand why was this museum built on this site, and they'll be going through the archives looking at these reports and thinking they should have listened. We can't say now that we don't understand these risks.
In summary, what this part of the report says is that the proposed escape routes in the case of a flood involve navigating your way up the overland flood routes, which will have a cascade of water coming down to them. And further, that in terms of the Undercroft space, there literally won't be an escape route because it's directed towards the river. People will be trapped inside with nowhere to go and they may drown. That's my layperson summary of this. Is that how you understand it?
Absolutely, exactly.
Just to turn to another, Dr. Griffin, is the Parramatta development actually a museum or is it an entertainment centre?
I think that's an important question, Chairman. If the space was sufficiently large, there possibly would be nothing wrong with trying to have it serve as a multi-purpose building, multi-purpose building. Just as I've said, it's not sufficiently large, but the point is that it is being promoted as the Parramatta Museum or the Powerhouse Museum at Parramatta, and that is clearly not what it is. It is being misrepresented. I would like to go to the larger issue just quickly. One of the major problems with this whole exercise is that the people you would expect to be expert in the whole project or set of projects, the peak staff of the museum, are not really, they don't have, as Kylie said, agency in the proposal, so they're simply being told this is what you'll have, get on and run it. Now, there is a major issue not confined to museums but generally, that centralised control doesn't work. If you want things to work, the people who are going to make it work have to have a major say in the way it's set up. and the way it's run. That doesn't mean to say that everything they say is agreed to, but they must have a major say. Otherwise, it'll fall over. If you go to the successful museums or the successful organisations anywhere, they are those where the staff that are involved and the leaders are critically involved. Indeed, there are instances where organisations seemed about to fail, and in the end, the board of directors or whatever said, look, unless you can come up with some solution, the organisation's going to fail. And the staff and the organisation find a solution. Here we've got the staff and indeed, as Kylie said, the trustees not involved, and indeed on the board as was currently constituted, so far as I can understand, there is no one with any expertise in any matter, in any branch or any discipline or any field of knowledge that bears upon the museum and its development, which is extraordinary.
Ms. Winkworth, during your 8 years on the Board of Trustees, can you remember an occasion or a time where there would be such a disempowerment of the board? Because we had the chair or president, I can't remember the official title, but Professor Barney Glover here, and he was informed that he had been told, I think, less than 48 hours before the announcement. Can you remember an occasion?
This is the 4 July announcement.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry, thank you, David. The July 4th announcement. Can you think of an occasion where, when you were the board, that you were ambushed or surprised by something like that?
No, I can't, and particularly not something that so directly affects the fate of the museum. In fact, when I was on the board, there was an ill-conceived attempt to merge the Australian Museum and the Powerhouse Museum, and our chair, Dr. Nick Pappas...
I remember it distinctly.
You remember? Yes.
I have to declare an interest. I was around at the time, and I do remember the... But no.
We'll have a separate hearing into that.
But the board stood up to the minister and the premier.
Yes, I want to hear Miss.
I want to hear Ms. Winkworth.
Said they would never agree to your proposal to move to Parramatta. Is that right?
But Ms. Winkworth, leave out names, but please invite. No. I'm not making light of this.
No.
That
It's
your board at the time stood up to the premier.
Yes, and it's a very important point because boards, and Des will talk perhaps more about the role of governance and independent trusts, but they're established to have custody of museums over and above the day-to-day politics and the political cycle of elected governments, because they have custody of the museum's assets, its collection and its buildings, so that they can be passed on to the next generation. And I'm sorry to say there's been a very unfortunate collapse of understanding of what that trust and governance when you're a statutory trust should mean. And I do credit Dr. Nick Pappas and the then chair of the Australian Museum that we fought very strongly to make the case for why the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences should be maintained independently. And since that time, there was another episode in Western Australia, I think, where they tried to merge two boards. What's very disturbing about what's happening in New South Wales at the moment is the tendency of the government to ignore the statutory enabling legislation of the museums. So we have a case at the moment where the government has effectively merged Historic Houses Trust, Sydney Living Museums, and the State Records Authority into one organisation, even though they have separate legislation. And then we have Minister Stokes, if I'm allowed to say him, creating a new super parks agency and ignoring the enabling legislation that was created to protect those parks, those distinctive parks with their own particular remit. I think it's unhealthy, and if the government thinks legislation should be changed, then they should take it to Parliament and make the case. What is important, I think, is that these issues are getting more ventilation, and it's good there's an inquiry that's happening into the merger of Historic Houses Trust and the Archives Authority, which I think will be the merger of which will be a disaster for both organisations, I predict. But at least it's getting a hearing. But I must say I've been very disappointed when I read the submissions to that inquiry that the chairs of those trusts have not recognised the distinctive remit that each body has and defended the independence of those two organisations.
Now, can I take you to the Powerhouse Alliance that you're actively involved in? So, since the July 4th announcement, have you had meetings or dialogue or briefings from the Minister on what the government's planning to do?
We have had lunch with the Minister.
Oh,
and
how did that go?
it was frank and very useful.
Oh, good.
The Powerhouse Museum Alliance has always been willing to offer advice to all parties in government, Labor,
I read your
Liberal,
email. I read
and
your email.
Yes, and especially a National Party too. And we are very ready to help the government find a way out of this dilemma. The Minister has said it wasn't his making. He's inherited what was a stupid decision, which has rolled on like a snowball, and now with difficulty
Did he recently say this?
Didn't he say that to your inquiry?
Well,
The last hearing?
not quite in that context.
No, I don't remember him using the word stupid.
Oh, right. Oh, no, sorry.
wasn't-
No. Why are you
No.
guys correcting Hansard?
I didn't say it was stupid. Thank you.
it's
Thank you
been-
for the correction.
Well, that actually wasn't the part I was referring to, but thank you for highlighting that.
Okay, but-
the inference being that he somehow or other picked this up as a new project. Is that what you're saying?
It wasn't.
When he was.
It wasn't Minister Harwin's decision to move the museum to Parramatta. He inherited this when he came in as minister in
Give him that.
2017.
But then he got right in behind him.
Okay.
I think he's
As you did originally.
the record. The record.
I saw
proves
the
that.
light.
And the record.
I
record
recanted.
proves that, and I think it's very clear that
Okay,
he's
now I get
implementing
it.
someone else's decision.
Yes. The Powerhouse Museum Alliance is keen to help the government find a way out of this policy and planning an infrastructure mess in a way that does deliver a great new museum to Parramatta.
As this committee is too. We've made recommendations to that effect.
But Ms. Winkworth, everyone accepts your bona fides. That in fact, you personally funded a study on the flood concerns. So no one is disputing that you are working positively. That you want to see. Now there's going to be two museums. You want to see the best possible museum on both locations. Would that be correct?
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just ask a quick question, Mr. Chair? Dr. Griffin, I just wanted to pick up on a really interesting comment that you made about the fact that you felt that regional museums should be linked in some kind of network. I'd just love you to extrapolate on that and tell us a little more detail about what your views are in that space.
Thank you. For reasons I've never fully understood, art museums have developed in many, almost all states, and in networks. And those networks have allowed not just the showing of their own collections, and I think of the museum recently opened in Lismore and the one in the valley nearby. My geography is not very good, so I can't remember what it is, but anyway. Not only the museum's own collections, but also travelling exhibitions. So an exhibition may be developed by an art museum, regional art museum in Bendigo, let's say, and that then tours to other museums in different locations. And although there's been a lot of debate, sometimes acrimonious, about travelling exhibitions, for the most part the criticisms have been ill-founded. the circulation of exhibitions allows people in many different places to view items, and very often really outstanding items, and even outstanding interpretations that they would not see were the regional museum in a particular location to only focus on its own collections. In addition, of course, as a network, the staff in those regional museums would be able to share expertise, discuss problems, discuss solutions, and so on and so forth. And indeed, there's a Regional Museums Association in New South Wales, I believe. I'm not familiar with it now. But of course, it has not really managed to develop very far because support for regional museums has been poor.
Do you think that this network should be overseen by a body like, for example, Museums and Galleries New South Wales, or do you think that it should be more organic in that these museums should potentially be encouraged to, but should have a more informal network between themselves where they can have these sorts of travelling exhibitions?
I think the latter. I think there's an extraordinary tendency for governments to, perhaps in the belief that they have substantial expertise, to issue edicts as to what should happen in complicated institutions like museums, and they are complicated, and they do have their own issues of policy development, to say this is what should happen, or, in the case you mentioned, a coordinating arrangement. It's quite possible for largely independent museums or organisations of any kind to form alliances which are perfectly capable of cooperating very productively and developing combined expertise. Often the desired outcomes can be achieved by the way in which special grants are administered. What bothers me about the present situation with regional museums in New South Wales is that by and large funding is provided for each one on the basis that eventually, even in the short term, the local government body is expected to fund them. Now, as if the real concern, on the one hand, the real concern is only local, but then on the other, well, they should be supported if they bring tourists. Now, those two ideas are not compatible. There are several museums in New South Wales, as presently constituted, which are of possibly national significance. And I think of the Age of Fishes Museum and Sheer Outback. And those are both truly outstanding and deserve ongoing substantial financial support by the state government. And the present funding arrangements are, as I understand it, pretty minimal and are unlikely to achieve any great advance.
So just to close the circle on this issue, do you think there should be a established funding stream for touring exhibitions that can be applied for by regional museums? Like, is this how you propose? I'm just trying to get my head around how can the state support this better, right? So if there's a funding stream and they need to put in applications, say, right, we've got this exhibition, we want to tour it to 4 or 5 other museums in regional New South Wales, but we'd like $100,000 for that or something. Is that the sort of thing that you say that we should be doing?
It is.
Okay.
If you look at major art museums in each of the capital cities, indeed that situation has applied since about 1978 or whatever, with a succession of various bodies which in fact did provide funding for major exhibitions, and some of those have been truly outstanding and would never have occurred without that funding body. The funding is not always direct, of course. Those are major exhibitions from overseas. Sometimes it's a matter of covering the insurance likelihood. But yes.
And the state support a lot of art exhibitions as well,
Yes,
even
correct,
the Year
yes.
12
the
ones,
states have also assisted.
But you're
in
saying that museums as well. All right, I
Yes.
won't take up any more time, Mr Chair, but I think that's a really interesting
Yes,
suggestion.
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Griffin, given your experience as the director of the Australian Museum and then leadership positions in museums since, could I just ask for your observations on some of the conclusions about the Powerhouse people and people management survey.
People Matters.
People Matters survey, the annual survey of public servants in New South Wales that tries to independently assess how organisations are going. And when it comes to the organisation's sort of functioning with its management, when they're asked, the proportion of staff who agree with the following propositions are as follows. I feel that change is managed well in my organisation, 20%. I feel that senior managers listen to employees, 28%. I believe senior managers provide clear direction for the future of the organisation, 28%. I feel that senior managers effectively lead and manage change, 29%. I'm satisfied with the career opportunities available for career development in my organisation, 30%. I have confidence in the ways my organisation resolves grievances, 31%. I could go on. If you were the director of an organisation that had that kind of feedback from your staff, what would your response be?
I would think it was entirely unsatisfactory. The key issues in any organisation are the way in which the staff are fully engaged in understanding the processes for making decisions and how to work together productively, and have strong support for leadership of the museum. That can be, I mean, the inquiry you mentioned, the questions are entirely appropriate and reveal a situation which, as you possibly suggest, are unsatisfactory. There are problems there, demonstrated also by, I think, a fairly high turnover of staff. Now, if you look at the very best museums around the world, as I have, admittedly small sample, but the characteristics are cohesive leadership and visitor-focused public programming. Now, obtaining cohesive leadership in an organisation as diverse as most museums is hard work. And that hard work has to be supported by the board. And that's not always possible either. I mean, it has been said of boards that they should hoot when they go into the wrong part of the forest, but that many boards don't even know where the forest is. And I think that goes to the way in which the government appoints persons to the board. And too often people are appointed who don't have any particular understanding of the museum. And I think that's possibly the situation here, or I emphasise possibly. It's certainly in my own case in the Australian Museum, very often the difficulties arose because sufficient care was not paid to those issues. But I can also say, which can be verified by consulting staff, that the museum over the time from 1954, when an outstanding director was appointed, through to possibly, it's for others to say, but my own time, there was a very high degree of commitment, of cohesiveness, of involvement, and of support, to the point where sometimes it was a problem if I said, well, this is what we should do. People would say, yes, that's a good idea, which I don't think is always the best. But those are very important characteristics, and I don't think that has been paid any attention whatsoever. Just helicoptering people in from outside on the basis that, oh no, we need to always have the best person in charge of the organisation, so we'll put them on limited term contracts. Or we need to ensure that efficiency is achieved, so we'll have those ridiculous annual cuts in funds, efficiency dividends. I mean, those kinds of things are utterly stupid. The best organisations, in fact, have executives that have been there for a long time. Consider the Australian Chamber Orchestra. Consider the Netherlands Dance Theatre. Consider the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Edmund Capon was there for 30 years. No one would suggest they should have gone along after he was there for 10 years and said, well, Edmund, you've had a good go, you know, bugger off. And all these things are just not sufficiently considered. The purpose of government, the most productive purpose of government, is to ensure that best practice is observed and to encourage that, to encourage discussion and awareness vigorously with museums around the world and so on and so forth. They aren't, to imagine that government, even ministers, should say, now, of course, why don't you do such and such in this museum, is just delusional.
Dr. Griffin, so at the last hearing, Professor Barney Glover indicated that he was going to vacate the chair or the presidency or the senior position at the end of the year. So what you just said indicates the importance of a robust, strong, independent leader appointed to the position. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes.
Yes.
I think there are other characteristics very often. Yes, very often. Chairs are appointed because they've done well in business, or they've done well somewhere or other, or they're an entrepreneur, and often an entrepreneur is about the worst person you want as a chairman. The principal role of the chair is to make sure that the board works together with all those techniques that are well known, which you would know, sir, about getting groups to work together.
Oh, I don't know if you can make a concession.
I don't know whether.
Oh, I've been known to do that. I've been known to do that.
Notorious for bringing people together, isn't he, Phil?
Order.
In government, not in opposition. In government's a different thing.
Well, even in government, I'm not sure.
I was assuming that there would be a knowledge of these things. I didn't make any supposition as to whether they were practiced. But these things are important. They're important in every organisation. If you look at satisfaction surveys or whatever of the kind that Mr. Schubert mentioned, those are vitally important issues, and they're largely ignored.
Well, I didn't
And
take you.
you end up people hating the organisation they work for. Now, there's been surveys done of this. Something like 28% of people express satisfaction with the organisation they're working in. That's not very good.
No.
You're not going to get much progress on that basis.
Professor Miller, from a
20%.
we're over time now, but from a historical perspective, how would you categorise or classify the importance of the Powerhouse Museum, especially as it's located in Ultimo?
Well, I think the Powerhouse Museum in Ultimo is a tremendously important organisation. It's a remarkable achievement, and it hasn't been allowed so far a very long lease of life. It seems to me that what would concern me particularly is that it be given the opportunity to continue telling and developing and changing these stories, that really do need to be told. I mean, one of the things that I actually went on a tour of the exhibitions earlier this week. And one of the things that struck me was the environmental questions that relate these days to steam power and fossil fuel-based power. They're so important now. I mean, the Maudsley engine, as I understand it, helped seriously to denude the forests around Goulburn because it was burning wood in its boilers. The Bolton and Watt engine is now seen as the beginning of the process that's delivering us climate change. And those stories need to be told. They're not being told. It needs the whole apparatus of a museum like the Powerhouse to develop those stories and tell them effectively with the tremendous objects that they have. So it's a wonderful institution, and it deserves to keep doing its job.
Okay, look, thank you very much for coming today. Thanks for input, and we'll call it to an end just now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.